Something feels off right now in the WNBA, and fans can sense it, even if they can't quite explain it yet. On the surface, everything looks perfect. Attendance records, ratings spikes, jerseys flying off shelves, headlines screaming growth momentum, and a new era for women's basketball. But behind the scenes, the league is sitting on a pressure point that could crack everything open. Because while the public is being told this is the strongest moment in WNBA history, negotiations behind closed doors are starting to look desperate. Not tense, not intense, desperate. And the reason isn't just money. It's leverage, it's timing, and it's one move that quietly changed how ownership views the players' union entirely. A move that was supposed to show strength, but instead raised eyebrows across the league office. Because when a union believes it has power, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't ask for sympathy. And it definitely doesn't ask fans to sign their name on a public link. Yet that's exactly what happened. And once that happened, everything shifted. Owners didn't panic. They didn't rush back to the table. They didn't blink. They waited. Because to people who live inside spreadsheets and balance sheets, one thing matters more than emotion, more than messaging, and more than noise. Signals. And the signal that just got sent was louder than any press release could ever be. But that wasn't the whole story. Because the petition wasn't the problem by itself. The real issue is what it revealed about the union's position at the exact moment the league's biggest financial opportunity is sitting right in front of them. And to understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to rewind to how this negotiation actually started, and why expectations inside the Players Association may have drifted far away from financial reality. This negotiation didn't fall apart overnight. It didn't collapse because of one meeting, one tweet, or one bad headline. It slowly drifted into trouble. And that's what makes it more dangerous. The WNBA entered this CBA cycle riding a wave it had never experienced before. Not just modest growth, not incremental improvement, but real cultural momentum. Games pulling in viewers who had never watched before. Arenas filling up in markets that barely paid attention just a few seasons ago. Merchandise moving at a pace the league wasn't built for. Inside the union, that momentum created belief. And belief can be powerful. But belief without discipline is where negotiations start to go sideways. Because from the players' perspective, this moment felt historic. The league finally had attention. The media finally cared. Corporate sponsors were finally showing up. To many players, it felt like the leverage they'd been waiting decades for had finally arrived. So expectations rose. Fast. Meanwhile, ownership was looking at the same moment through a completely different lens. Yes, growth was real. Yes, interest was exploding. But they were also staring at operating costs, long-term sustainability, revenue splits, and the reality that the league still leans on outside financial support to stay stable. Two sides. Same moment. Completely different interpretations. That gap is where the tension started. At first, everything stayed quiet. Negotiations extended. Deadlines moved. Language stayed professional. Both sides publicly claimed progress, even when none was visible. But under the surface, something wasn't lining up. Because when talks drag on this long during a moment of growth, it usually means one thing. The numbers don't match the narrative. And that's when frustration crept in. From the union side, delays started to feel intentional. Like ownership was stalling. Like the league was waiting out momentum, hoping the noise would die down and players would lose confidence. From the ownership side, the posture coming back across the table felt unrealistic. Not aggressive in a calculated way, but detached from the financial structure of the league itself. That's when the conversation stopped being about compromise and started becoming about pressure. And pressure is where mistakes happen. Because once a union believes it's being ignored, the instinct is to go public, to show strength, to demonstrate support, to make it look like the entire fan base is standing behind them, ready to explode if ownership doesn't cave. But here's the thing no one wants to admit. Going public only works if the crowd is already moving, if fans are already angry, if sponsors are already uncomfortable, if the league feels heat from outside forces it can't control. Otherwise, you're not applying pressure. You're revealing your hand. And that's exactly the risk the Players Association walked into. Because instead of tightening strategy behind closed doors, instead of anchoring demands to carefully framed growth metrics, instead of forcing ownership to react first, they made a move that suggested impatience. A move that suggested the internal leverage wasn't as strong as they hoped. A move that said, without saying it out loud, "We need help." And once ownership saw that signal, the dynamic changed instantly. The negotiation room doesn't get louder when that happens. It gets quieter. Because owners don't need to argue with emotion. They don't need to debate narratives. They don't need to win on social media. They just need to wait. And the longer they wait, the more pressure shifts back onto the players, especially the ones who can't afford delays, missed checks, or a season hanging in limbo. That's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say on camera. This isn't just about star players with endorsements and side income. This is about over 100 players whose entire professional income flows through this league. And when negotiations stall, they feel it first. Which is why the next move mattered so much. Because instead of signaling confidence, the union's public play exposed a vulnerability ownership never even had to exploit. And that's where the petition enters the story. Not as a headline, not as a joke, but as a turning point. Because what happened next quietly told owners everything they needed to know. And once they saw it, the leverage conversation was effectively over. On paper, the idea sounded simple. Rally the fans. Show public support. Demonstrate momentum outside the negotiation room. In theory, it's a classic pressure move. If enough people show up publicly, ownership is supposed to feel heat. Sponsors start watching. Media starts framing the league as at risk. And suddenly, the people holding the money feel like they're the ones on the clock. But here's the part most fans don't understand. In professional sports negotiations, how you go public matters just as much as when you go public. And this timing was off. Because when a players' union releases a public petition during active negotiations, it sends a very specific message. Not to fans, but to owners. It says private leverage has stalled. It says the internal pressure points aren't working. And most importantly, it says leadership believes external force is now required to move the needle. That's not strength. That's a pivot. And pivots are dangerous when you don't control the response. The petition was framed as an action alert, something designed to feel urgent, collective, and powerful. The wording suggested fans were being called into a movement, almost like this was the moment everyone needed to show up or risk losing something important. But when owners looked at it, they weren't seeing passion. They were seeing math. Because owners don't interpret petitions emotionally. They interpret them numerically. They don't ask, "Is this heartfelt?" They ask, "Is this scalable?" They ask, "Is this real?" And most importantly, they ask, "What happens if we do nothing?" And that's where the problem started. Because when you put pressure in public, you invite measurement. Every click becomes data. Every signature becomes a signal. Every hour that passes without momentum becomes a quiet answer. And the response wasn't explosive. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't even particularly loud. Instead, it was modest. And modest support is far worse than no support at all. Because silence can be explained away. Low numbers cannot. To ownership, this didn't look like a fan base ready to riot. It looked like a niche response inside a league that had just spent months bragging about record-breaking attention. The contrast was impossible to ignore. And once that contrast became visible, the entire leverage narrative cracked. Because now the question wasn't, will fans revolt if this stalls? The question became, where are they? And that's a brutal shift in perception. The owners didn't need to mock the move publicly. They didn't need to respond at all. In negotiations, silence is often the loudest answer. What they saw was a union attempting to demonstrate unity at the exact moment unity needed to already be obvious. And that's the detail that makes this uncomfortable. You don't ask fans to prove support if support is already undeniable. You use support as proof. The petition didn't create leverage. It tested it. And the results weren't what the union needed them to be. Because from the outside, this move didn't make ownership feel cornered. It made them feel confirmed. Confirmed that the public pressure campaign they feared wasn't actually there. Confirmed that the risk of backlash was manageable. Confirmed that waiting might be the smartest strategy of all. And waiting costs ownership almost nothing. But it costs players everything. Especially the ones without safety nets. Especially the ones whose names never trend. Especially the ones who don't have off-court income to soften the blow. This is the part that rarely gets discussed publicly. Negotiation delays don't hurt the league equally. Stars can wait. Owners can wait. Networks can pivot. But role players live month to month. So when leadership chooses public optics over quiet progress, the stakes aren't theoretical. They're personal. And that's why this moment mattered so much. Because the petition didn't just ask fans for support. It revealed the union's urgency. It showed impatience. And impatience is the one thing you never want to show when you're sitting across from billionaires who make their living waiting out storms. But the petition wasn't the end of the miscalculation. Because right after that, the messaging shifted again. Instead of tightening focus, it widened. Instead of sharpening the argument, it diluted it. And that's when the conversation drifted into something even more damaging. Because while asking for public support, the union also started pointing to growth metrics, attendance, viewership, star power, as proof that their demands were not just fair but overdue. And that sounds logical, until you look at how they framed it. Because when you brag about growth without anchoring it to who actually generated it, you open a door that owners are more than happy to walk through. And that door leads straight into the most uncomfortable part of this entire negotiation. The part everyone keeps dancing around. The part that changes the math completely. The Caitlin Clark effect. And once that name enters the conversation, everything gets a lot more complicated. Once the petition went public, the conversation shifted fast. Not because ownership reacted emotionally, but because the framing from the union side began to harden. The tone wasn't just about fairness anymore. It became about entitlement, about what players believed they were owed in this moment of growth. And that's where negotiations usually break down, because belief and balance sheets don't speak the same language. Behind the scenes, ownership wasn't denying that raises were necessary. In fact, they were already signaling willingness to move further than the league ever had before. The reported framework included major salary expansion, paths where top earners could clear seven figures when revenue components were factored in, average salaries rising dramatically, minimums that would fundamentally change life for players who had been scraping by just a few seasons earlier. From a historical WNBA perspective, these weren't token gestures. They were massive jumps. But here's the problem. When expectations rise faster than revenue structures, every offer starts to look like an insult, even when it isn't. Inside the Players Association, the mindset seemed to shift from "let's lock in sustainable growth" to "this is the moment to reset everything." Not just salaries, but power dynamics, control, revenue splits, the entire economic relationship between labor and ownership. And that's where talks slowed. Because ownership wasn't negotiating against headlines. They were negotiating against projections, long-term obligations, and the reality that growth surges don't always last forever. They've seen this before. Leagues catch fire, interest spikes, stars emerge, and then the market corrects. So while players were looking at packed arenas and viral clips, owners were looking at operating losses, travel costs, media deals, and the fact that much of the league's stability still depends on careful financial management. Two realities, same table. And instead of narrowing that gap, the messaging started to widen it. Public statements leaned into the idea that ownership was stalling, disrespecting players, and jeopardizing the future of women's basketball. That language plays well online. It activates emotion. It creates a villain, but it doesn't move negotiations. Because when owners hear that framing while also offering historic raises, they don't feel pressure. They feel misrepresented. And misrepresentation kills trust. This is where the optics started working against the union. From the outside, casual fans heard players are being disrespected and assumed ownership was lowballing. But inside the room, the offers being discussed told a different story. A story of owners trying to stretch the league's financial ceiling without snapping it in half. And here's the detail that rarely gets acknowledged. Ownership doesn't win by crushing players. They win by keeping the league alive. A CBA that overextends the business doesn't help anyone 5 years down the line. And owners know that if they agree to numbers that can't be sustained, the correction will be brutal, and it will hit players first. So instead of escalating, they slowed everything down. They let the public noise play out. They let the petition exist. They let the accusations circulate. Because they knew something the union couldn't afford to confront directly. Public pressure only works if the public understands the math. And most fans don't. Fans see sold-out games and assume profit. They see jersey sales and assume cash flow. They see viral moments and assume financial security. But owners see margins. And the margins were still thin. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire situation. Because while the union was arguing for collective growth, ownership kept circling one quiet truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. Not all growth is evenly distributed. Not all players generate equal revenue. And pretending otherwise doesn't make it true. This is where the negotiations stopped being about fairness and started being about honesty. Because the league's recent surge wasn't driven by a balanced wave of interest across every market and every roster. It was driven by gravity. One name pulling attention. One storyline changing behavior. One player shifting how casual fans interacted with the league. And when the union talked about growth without naming that reality, they weakened their own case. Because if you're going to argue value, you have to be willing to identify where that value comes from. And that's the line the Players Association wouldn't cross. Not publicly, not privately, which left ownership with a silent advantage. They didn't have to say the name. They didn't have to point fingers. They just had to let the numbers sit there. And the numbers kept telling the same story. That's why the next phase of this negotiation was never about salaries alone. It was about control. It was about whether the union was willing to anchor demands to real revenue drivers, or keep pretending the surge was evenly shared. And that refusal created a tension that no amount of online support could fix. Because once the conversation drifts away from reality, the outcome becomes inevitable. While the headlines focus on power, money, and public standoffs, there's a group being quietly dragged through the middle of this mess. They aren't the stars. They aren't the faces on posters. They aren't the names driving debate on social media. They're the majority, and they're the ones with the least margin for error. For these players, a delayed deal isn't a strategy issue. It's a financial threat. Every week negotiations stall, uncertainty grows. Overseas contracts get harder to plan. Training schedules become guesswork. Income windows shrink. This is the part that gets lost when negotiations turn performative. Because leverage games feel abstract until paychecks disappear. Star players can absorb chaos. Endorsements, appearances, off-season opportunities, they create insulation. But for role players, minimum contract players, and veterans nearing the end of their careers, the league is the income stream. There's no safety net. And when leadership adopts an all-or-nothing posture, they're gambling with other people's stability. That's why this moment is so dangerous. The longer talks drag out, the more power quietly shifts back to ownership. Not because they're stronger, but because they can afford patience. Owners don't miss rent payments. Owners don't scramble for off-season income. Owners don't worry about a lost year aging them out of the league. Players do. And ownership knows that. That's why the waiting game always favors capital. This isn't cruelty. It's structure. Which is why public pressure only works if it's overwhelming. Anything less doesn't scare ownership. It reassures them. It tells them players will eventually fold to protect their livelihoods. And that reality hangs over every delay. What makes this even harder to watch is that there was a cleaner path forward. The union could have narrowed demands around quality-of-life upgrades that resonate publicly and privately. Travel standards, healthcare guarantees, career security. These are issues that build broad sympathy without challenging the league's financial foundation. Instead, the focus stayed locked on headline numbers. And headline numbers are dangerous when they outpace profit. Because the moment the union started sounding like a league operating on NBA economics, credibility started slipping. Not with fans, but with the people actually writing the checks. And once credibility slips in negotiations, everything slows down. Which leads to the next problem. Because while this internal tension was growing, the union's messaging began drifting further away from how the business side of sports actually works. The language got sharper. The accusations got louder. The urgency got more performative. And that's when ownership stopped feeling pressure altogether. Because billionaires don't negotiate on vibes. They negotiate on leverage. And right now, the leverage wasn't where the union thought it was. The uncomfortable truth is this. Ownership didn't need to outmaneuver anyone. They just needed to let the union keep talking. Every post, every petition, every public escalation. Each one quietly stripped away negotiating power. And the reason is simple. Public pressure doesn't scare owners unless it threatens revenue. And most of the new fans tuning in weren't tuning in for the league. They were tuning in for something specific. Something singular. Which brings us back to the elephant in the room. Because the league's growth story doesn't work the same way when you isolate where the attention is actually coming from. And once that reality enters the conversation, the negotiation math changes completely. On the surface, the growth story sounds unstoppable. Record attendance, Ratings popping across platforms. Merchandise selling faster than ever. Social engagement exploding in ways the league has never seen before. If you only listen to the headlines, it feels obvious. This is the moment. This is when the WNBA finally arrived. And if that's true, then of course players should be demanding a bigger piece of the pie. That's the logic driving a lot of the union's confidence right now. But here's the problem. Growth headlines don't tell the full story. And when negotiations hinge on incomplete stories, reality eventually catches up. Because growth isn't one thing. It's a collection of very specific behaviors. Who bought tickets? Which games sold out? Which broadcasts spiked? Which jerseys moved? Which cities suddenly mattered? And when ownership breaks that data down, the picture becomes a lot less evenly distributed than the public narrative suggests. Yes, attendance was up, but it wasn't up everywhere. Yes, viewership surged, but it didn't surge for every matchup. Yes, merchandise exploded, but it wasn't spread evenly across rosters. That distinction matters more than fans realize. Because owners don't pay salaries based on vibes. They pay them based on predictable revenue streams. And predictable revenue only exists when demand is consistent, not just concentrated. This is where the union's messaging started to drift into dangerous territory. By leaning on total growth numbers without acknowledging concentration, they opened themselves up to the easiest counterargument ownership could possibly make. If this growth is real and sustainable, prove it without pointing to one phenomenon. And that's a challenge no one on the union side seemed eager to answer. Instead, messaging leaned into a generalized boom narrative. The idea that the league as a whole had crossed a financial threshold that justified sweeping economic changes across every contract, every roster spot, every obligation. But ownership knows better. They've seen leagues inflate too quickly. They've seen revenue spikes that disappear when stars leave, storylines cool off, or novelty wears thin. They've seen what happens when cost structures are built on peaks instead of baselines. So when players talked about growth as if it were permanent, owners heard risk. And risk makes negotiations conservative. That's why offers focused on structured increases. On escalators. On revenue-linked components instead of flat guarantees that could cripple the league if the moment fades. From the union's perspective, that felt like hesitation. Like ownership wasn't believing in the product. From ownership's perspective, it was basic survival. This disconnect is why both sides keep talking past each other. Players see packed arenas and think leverage. Owners see uneven demand and think caution. And neither side is completely wrong. But pretending the growth wave is evenly distributed across the league weakens the argument for sweeping change. Because the uncomfortable truth is this. If growth were evenly spread, ownership wouldn't need to be convinced. The math would sell itself. The reason negotiations are this tense is because everyone in the room knows where the momentum actually came from. And that momentum has a face. One that keeps showing up in ticket spikes, broadcast anomalies, and merch data. One that changes the value conversation entirely. Which is why the most telling part of the union's messaging wasn't what they said about growth. It was what they didn't say. They talked about stars. They named players. They celebrated attendance. But they carefully avoided centering the one name that could instantly anchor their entire argument. Because acknowledging that name creates a problem. It forces a hard question. If one player drives disproportionate revenue, how do you negotiate collective economics without admitting imbalance? And that's the line the Players Association didn't want to cross. But ownership didn't need them to say it. They already had the data. And once that data sits quietly on the table, everything else becomes noise. Because growth isn't just about how loud the moment feels. It's about who actually pulled it forward. And once you isolate that truth, the negotiation stops being emotional. It becomes mathematical. There's a reason this part of the conversation keeps getting danced around. Because once you say it out loud, the entire structure of the argument shifts. The league's recent surge wasn't random. It wasn't evenly distributed. And it definitely wasn't driven by a sudden, collective awakening to every roster in the WNBA. It was driven by gravity. One player pulling attention so hard that it bent the league's visibility around her. And everyone involved knows it. You can see it in ticket demand. Cities that struggled to sell out suddenly had waiting lists when she came to town. You can see it in broadcast behavior, ratings spiking not just year over year, but game over game depending on whether she was on the floor. You can see it in merchandise trends, social engagement, and the way casual fans talk about the league for the first time in their lives. This wasn't subtle. It was seismic. And yet, when the Players Association talked about growth, that name barely appeared in official framing. Not because she isn't respected, but because centering her exposes a contradiction the union didn't want to confront. Because the moment you acknowledge that one player drove an outsized share of attention, you introduce imbalance into a collective negotiation. And imbalance is uncomfortable. It forces questions like, how do you justify league-wide guarantees on momentum generated by a singular phenomenon? How do you argue equal value when attention clearly isn't equal? How do you build a long-term economic model around something that might not repeat? These are the questions ownership was already asking. And by avoiding them publicly, the union gave ownership space to ask them privately, without resistance. That's where leverage quietly slipped away. Because instead of anchoring demands to the strongest proof of value, the union diluted the argument by spreading credit across names that don't move numbers the same way. This isn't about disrespect. It's about honesty. Owners don't care about narratives. They care about causation. They want to know what changed, why it changed, and whether it can be sustained. And the answer to that first question has a very clear name, which makes the silence around it impossible to ignore. From ownership's point of view, this silence wasn't strategic, it was revealing. It suggested leadership knew the truth, but didn't want to deal with the implications. Because if the league's boom is tied to one player, then the safest move for ownership is to wait. Let the moment breathe. See if the attention holds. See if demand spreads. See if the league can convert hype into habit. Why rush into long-term commitments when the sample size is still developing? That logic is brutal, but it's rational. And the union's refusal to address it directly made that logic even stronger. Meanwhile, attempts to substitute other names into the growth narrative didn't land. Fans didn't respond the same way. Ratings didn't follow. Arenas didn't react. The market spoke. And markets don't negotiate. They dictate. Which brings us to the most frustrating part of this entire situation. The union actually had the strongest leverage it has ever had. But it came with a condition. They had to be willing to say where the momentum came from, and then build demands around converting that moment into long-term, shared growth. Instead, the messaging avoided the issue entirely. And avoidance is expensive in negotiations. Because while the union hesitated, ownership got clarity. They understood exactly what they were dealing with. A growth moment driven by a singular force. A public pressure campaign that didn't catch fire. And a workforce where many players can't afford prolonged uncertainty. That combination doesn't force concessions. It encourages patience. And patience always favors the side with capital. Which is why the next phase of this standoff is the most dangerous one yet. Because while stars and owners can afford to wait, the majority of players can't. And as time drags on, the risk doesn't land on the people with microphones. It lands on the ones with expiring contracts and shrinking windows. This is the point where the conversation stops being theoretical. Because while fans argue online and leadership trade statements, the calendar keeps moving. And time is the one variable that never negotiates. For a small group of players, delay is annoying. For most of the league, delay is dangerous. These are not athletes sitting on decade-long guaranteed contracts. Careers are short. Windows are tight. And for a large portion of the roster, one lost season isn't just a setback. It's the difference between staying in the league and quietly disappearing from it. That's the part missing from the public framing. When negotiations stall, stars can wait. Owners can wait. Networks can shuffle programming and survive. But the middle and lower tiers of the roster don't have that luxury. They plan their lives around certainty. Overseas contracts get lined up months in advance. Training schedules are mapped carefully to avoid burnout. Income is stacked season by season, not year by year. And when a CBA hangs in limbo, all of that gets scrambled. This is where leadership decisions become consequential. Because every extra week without clarity doesn't apply pressure to ownership. It applies pressure to players who can't afford to sit idle. The longer this drags out, the more likely it becomes that some players start breaking ranks quietly, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. That's how leverage collapses. Not with a dramatic announcement. Not with a public surrender. But with quiet acceptance behind the scenes. Ownership understands this better than anyone. They know exactly how long players can realistically hold out before financial reality forces compromise. And that's why the waiting game feels so calm on their side of the table. They don't need to threaten. They don't need to escalate. They just need to let time do its job. And time always works against labor when income isn't guaranteed. This creates a brutal internal contradiction for the union. Publicly, leadership has to project strength, confidence, control. They can't admit pressure. They can't acknowledge cracks. Because the moment they do, leverage evaporates. Privately, they know the math. They know how many players rely solely on WNBA checks. They know how many are one injury away from being replaced. They know how thin the margins are for players who aren't household names. And that knowledge turns every delay into a risk calculation. Push too hard, and you protect the top while sacrificing the middle. Fold too early, and you look weak after months of tough talk. That's the trap they're in now. And it's self-inflicted. Because this negotiation didn't have to drift into this territory. There was a path that balanced ambition with stability. A path that protected vulnerable players while still locking in meaningful progress. But once the strategy shifted toward optics, everything got harder. Because optics don't pay rent. And while the union focused on public narratives, ownership focused on fundamentals. On what the league can afford. On what it can commit to without putting the entire business at risk. From their perspective, the longer this takes, the clearer it becomes that players will eventually need a deal more than they do. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural one, which is why the endgame of this negotiation is already taking shape. Not because someone is winning loudly, but because someone can afford to lose quietly for longer. And that leads to the next uncomfortable question. What happens when this finally ends? Because when the deal does come, it likely won't look dramatically different from what was already on the table months ago. The numbers might move slightly. The language might be rebranded. The press release will claim victory. But the cost of delay will still exist. Lost income, missed opportunities, players forced to scramble or compromise behind closed doors. And that's the part no one will celebrate publicly. At some point, the noise dies down. Not because the issues are solved, but because reality steps in. Negotiations like this don't end with dramatic victories or viral moments. They end quietly. A press release drops. Both sides claim progress. Headlines focus on a few headline numbers, and most people move on. But the real story always sits in the details. And in this case, the ending is already starting to take shape. Because when you strip away the optics, the leverage, the petitions, and the public standoffs, one thing becomes unavoidable. Ownership doesn't have a reason to move dramatically from where they already are. They've offered historic raises relative to where the league has been. They've signaled willingness to expand revenue sharing within structured limits. They've shown patience while the union escalated publicly. From their perspective, the risk of waiting has been minimal. The union, on the other hand, is running into a wall created by time. As delays pile up, pressure doesn't build evenly across the membership. It concentrates. It hits the players who can least afford it. And that pressure eventually forces leadership to choose between prolonging the standoff or protecting the rank and file. That's when negotiations flip. Suddenly, the same framework that was criticized months earlier starts to look acceptable. Language gets softened. Messaging shifts from confrontation to collaboration. Numbers that were once framed as disrespectful get reframed as progress. And the deal gets done. Publicly, both sides will call it a win. Ownership will point to sustainability. The union will point to raises and protections. Fans will argue online about who folded. But beneath all of that, the outcome will quietly confirm what ownership understood from the beginning. That this growth moment, as powerful as it feels, doesn't yet justify a complete economic overhaul of the league. That the surge in attention is real, but concentrated. That patience was the smarter play. That public pressure without overwhelming support wasn't a threat. And most importantly, that time was always on their side. The hardest part is who absorbs the cost. It won't be the owners. It won't be the stars. It will be the players who lost weeks or months of income waiting for a deal that ended up resembling what was already available. Those players won't get press conferences. They won't get victory laps. They'll just move on, hoping the next negotiation is handled differently. That's the quiet damage of mismanaged leverage. This moment could have been used to lock in smarter, incremental gains tied directly to real revenue drivers. It could have set up a framework that grows alongside the league instead of racing ahead of it. Instead, it turned into a public standoff that revealed more weakness than strength. And once weakness is visible, it can't be unseen. The league didn't fail the players in this negotiation. The numbers were there. The momentum was there. The opportunity was real. What failed was strategy. Because in professional sports, timing is everything. And growth moments don't last forever. You either convert them into disciplined progress, or you watch them slip away while pretending you're still in control. That's the lesson sitting underneath this entire situation. And it's one the league, the union, and the players themselves will be dealing with long after the headlines fade. If you want the real breakdown when the final deal drops, the stuff that won't be in the press release, who actually moved, who quietly lost ground, and what this means for the future of the WNBA, make sure you're subscribed. Because when the noise clears and the numbers speak, that's when the truth comes out.